This video focuses on the moments when Hollywood's greatest actor of all time, Marlon Brando, paid the price for the tragedy of his own life while playing gods on screen. The most brutal and personal chapter of this tragedy was the tragic suicide of his beloved daughter, Cheyenne Brando. Cheyenne was like a chain reaction of her father's mistakes. The roots of Cheyenne's painful story lay in Marlon Brando's disordered and chaotic personal life. She grew up amid her father's numerous marriages, inconsistent relationships, and constantly changing family structure. Even his relationship with her mother, Tetiaroa, was stormy and unstable. Cheyenne spent her childhood in the shadow of this complex family, completely deprived of emotional stability and consistency. Brando showed his children affection, but this affection lacked a deep emotional bond. Just like on a movie set, people and relationships came and went. Cheyenne felt lost and vulnerable amid this immense fame and emotional turmoil. From an early age, she struggled with mental health issues. In her youth, she experienced deep depression, anxiety, and identity crises. Her father's fame was more of a heavy burden than an advantage to her. She struggled to find her own identity, crushed under Brando's shadow. This fragile state of mind, unfortunately, set the stage for the great tragedy that shook the family. This stage would lead her to that tragic night with her lover Tetiaroa, and ultimately to her final words to her father. If you're ready, let's begin the story. The roots of Cheyenne's painful story lay in Marlon Brando's sunny, but equally chaotic and disordered personal life. She was forced to grow up amid her father's countless marriages, inconsistent relationships, and constantly changing household structure. Her mother's relationship with Brando's third wife, Tetiaroa, was also stormy and unstable. Cheyenne spent her childhood completely deprived of emotional stability and consistency in the shadow of this complex family. Brando showed his children generous affection, but this affection lacked a deep emotional bond and regular attention. As if on a movie set, the people in Brando's life were constantly changing, and emotional bonds were fleeting. Cheyenne felt completely lost, forgotten, and vulnerable amid this enormous fame and emotional turmoil. She struggled with mental health issues from an early age. During her teenage years, she experienced deep depression, anxiety, and identity crises. His father's global fame was more of an overwhelming burden than an advantage or protection. He struggled to find his own identity, crushed under Brando's enormous shadow, which was difficult to overcome. Unfortunately, this fragile and weary state of mind had laid the groundwork for the ultimate tragedy that shook the Brando family from his childhood onwards. One of the turning points in Cheyenne's life was her relationship with her boyfriend Tetiaroa. Dag was a young man known for his quietness and gentle disposition, whom Brando had met on his island of Tetiaroa in Tahiti. Cheyenne believed she found in this calm and peaceful young man from Tahiti the tranquility and stability she could never find in her father's chaotic world. At first, this relationship was an escape for Cheyenne. However, the Brando family curse quickly poisoned this young love. Cheyenne's increasingly deteriorating, uncontrolled psychological state shook the foundation of the relationship. Growing paranoid suspicions, crises of insecurity, and uncontrolled emotional swings turned their love into a spiral of trauma and mutual exhaustion rather than a refuge. Their relationship had become a reflection of Cheyenne's mental storm. By the early months of 1990, Cheyenne was pregnant and her mental health was teetering on the edge of a precipice. During this period, she learned that Brando's own mother had committed suicide, and this situation began to manifest in her mind as delusions and horrific hallucinations. The deep-rooted traumas of the Brando family were dangerously reverberating in Cheyenne's fragile psyche. In this tense environment, her brother Christian Brando acted on his protective instincts toward his sister. Christian had become obsessively convinced by rumors that Dag had physically abused Cheyenne, or by Cheyenne's paranoid claims. When Christian arrived at the Brando mansion in Los Angeles, driven by his protective instinct, Dag and Cheyenne were there too. The home where Brando should have found peace was now a powder keg ready to explode. Christian's anger, Cheyenne's instability, and Dag's vulnerability weighed heavily on the mansion's atmosphere. With Christian viewing Dag as a threat to his sister, this tragic encounter was a harbinger of inevitable disaster. The countdown to that dreadful night, which no one could have predicted, had begun. On the night of May 16, 1990, the Brando estate became the scene of a tragedy. That moment of explosion, the gunfight that cost the life of Cheyenne's lover Dag Drolet, not only took Dag's life, but also dealt a blow to Cheyenne's already fragile mental health. As the sole witness to this tragic event, Cheyenne was left with irreparable wounds in her soul. The horror of that moment plunged her mind, already struggling with hallucinations, into complete chaos. Her statements to the police and later to the court were riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. On the one hand, she acted out of an instinct to protect her brother Christian, while on the other, she was experiencing delusions related to the horror of the event. This chaos completely shattered her mental health. Cheyenne was now not only a witness in the murder case, but also its most innocent and greatest victim. As the murder trial progressed, the pressure on Cheyenne became unbearable. Legal procedures, public pressure, and family destruction were rapidly pushing her into a deep abyss. Her condition deteriorated so badly that she struggled to actively participate in the court proceedings. The judge ruled that her mental health was not suitable for giving testimony. While this decision was a legal necessity, it was also a painful testament to how the family, the media, and society had failed to protect her. Cheyenne became increasingly isolated throughout this process. She was trapped between the cold walls of the courtroom and the cruel curiosity of the outside world. She sank into a deep depression, her mind constantly plagued by suicidal thoughts. Caught between the trauma of the incident, her brother's guilt, and her own psychological collapse, Cheyenne began to seek salvation elsewhere. She was now merely a shadow of the Brando tragedy. Following the shock of his son going to prison, Marlon Brando immediately focused all his attention on rescuing his daughter, Cheyenne Brando. He now had one goal: to remove her from courtrooms, the media, and, more importantly, the remnants of his own destructive past. In this desperation, Brando took Cheyenne to his personal paradise and escape route, his private island of Tetiaroa in Tahiti. This decision was a well-intentioned but also typical Brando solution. He believed he could solve the problem with money, location, and isolation. Indeed, it was breathtakingly beautiful, the most isolated and perfect piece of paradise on earth. Driven by his instinct to protect his daughter, Brando brought the best specialists, psychiatrists, and caregivers to the island. The most expensive treatments and the most luxurious conditions were at her disposal. Her father was offering her not just a physical refuge, but a perfect laboratory for healing. But what Brando forgot was this: psychological trauma cannot be healed by changing geography. The fragility Cheyenne carried within her became even more pronounced in this paradise setting. Tetiaroa, though a refuge from the outside, quickly turned into a cage in Cheyenne's eyes, where isolation and paranoia grew. After the horror experienced at the mansion, Cheyenne, whose mind was already shattered, felt trapped in this ostentatious prison her father had built for her. On this island, which had become the epicenter of the family's tragedy, Cheyenne was imprisoned within her own mind. The boundlessness of the ocean around her contrasted with the boundless emptiness and loneliness in her soul. The efforts of doctors and caregivers were insufficient because Cheyenne refused treatment and pushed away everyone her father sent. To her, these people were part of her father's control mechanism. In the golden cage on Tetiaroa, Cheyenne Brando's condition was worsening day by day. His mind could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. He was struggling with hallucinations, intense emotional swings, and, in particular, a growing rage toward his father, a rage fueled by both deep love and unforgivable hatred. During this period, the transatlantic phone calls with Brando were the only outlet for the storm raging inside Cheyenne. Each ring of the phone was not a lifeline for Marlon Brando, but a harbinger of an inevitable reckoning. It was at this point that Cheyenne's screams at her father rose, sealing Brando's fate forever. These were not merely the ravings of a mad woman, but the moment when years of emotional neglect and the accumulated toll of the Brando dynasty's chaos were finally exacted. Cheyenne was expressing to her father on the other end of the line the chronic feeling of abandonment she had experienced as a child, the emotional neglect amid her father's constantly changing wives and lovers, and the chaos created by the endless custody battles within the family. She was screaming that she had paid the price for this complicated life with her own mental health. The tremor and helplessness in her voice were a direct accusation to her father. The bill for this complicated life has been cut to my neck. Cheyenne's final words to her father were often filled with phrases like, "You should have saved me in time," and "Your selfish mistakes are killing me, Dad." These words were the harshest slap in the face to a father, instantly rendering Brando's legendary career meaningless. However, Marlon Brando, as always, chose to rationalize the situation rather than face emotional reality. Instead of accepting his daughter's painful words as a legitimate accusation from a child toward her father, he interpreted them as a symptom of her illness, a delusion in her mind. He believed he was a good father because he thought he had sent her financial and medical help. He had provided a physical refuge for his daughter. However, he was not hearing her most important and final cries. Those last words Cheyenne Brando said to her father would echo in Brando's ears for the rest of his life as an echo of regret and remorse. These words presented a reality that Marlon Brando had never experienced in any role in his career, an unheard farewell and an unacknowledged fatherly mistake. This was a sign that the drama Brando had created had reached an irreversible end. In that golden cage on Tetiaroa, the inevitable final act of the tragedy was staged. After years of family chaos, neglect, and mental breakdown, the calendar read April 16, 1995. Approximately 5 years after the Dag Drawlet murder case, Cheyenne Brando, plunged into the abyss of loneliness and despair, had lost all hope. Despite being on that paradise island created by her father to protect her from the evils of the world, under Marlon Brando's supervision, Cheyenne took her own life. She was only 25 years old. This news shocked Hollywood and the entire world. However, for Marlon Brando, it was not just a simple piece of news. It was an earthquake that destroyed all the defense mechanisms and emotional walls he had tried to build in recent years to keep himself going. Brando had managed to get his son out of prison by pleading in court, through manipulation, money, and his genius. But when it came to his daughter, all these worldly powers proved completely useless. He had provided a physical refuge for his own daughter, but he had failed to save her soul. This situation became Brando's greatest and most personal defeat as a father. Marlon Brando's chaotic lifestyle, selfish choices, and chronic emotional neglect had now turned into a tangible and destructive legacy. The effects were irreversible. On one side, Christian was recorded as a murderer stained with blood. On the other, Cheyenne was a young woman who couldn't withstand the chaos and committed suicide. This tragic event was the ultimate price of the curse that had fallen upon the Brando dynasty. All of Brando's legendary fame became meaningless in the face of these two horrific events. He could be the ruler of the world on screen, living life by his own rules, but when it came to the happiness and safety of his own children, he had failed completely. Cheyenne's suicide left a permanent wound in Marlon Brando's soul. He was no longer just a great actor, but a broken man who had witnessed the tragedy of his two children, burdened by deep guilt and remorse. This burden would define his remaining years and slowly drive him into seclusion. The suicide of his daughter Cheyenne marked the final chapter of Marlon Brando's life. Following this devastating blow, Brando virtually withdrew from the film world. He was no longer just a brilliant actor. He was a man spiritually bankrupt, struggling with deep remorse. He spent the rest of his life in semi-seclusion at his Brentwood estate. This seclusion brought about a physical change. He gained excessive weight. This weight gain was not just the result of an unhealthy lifestyle. It was an emotional wall Brando built against the judgmental eyes of the world. His goal was simple: to become invisible. He wanted to be left alone with his pain and regret, to completely isolate himself from the outside world. Brando lived in a luxury mansion worth millions of dollars, but in reality, he was in the deepest pit of loneliness and helplessness. Although there were many people around him, assistants, advisors, no one could truly reach his broken soul. Cheyenne's final, unheard cries continued to echo in Brando's mind as an endless pang of conscience. The unbearable regret of not being able to help his daughter when he could have, of not listening to her one last time, poisoned Brando's final years. This painful truth behind Marlon Brando's downfall strips away all the masks of fame and fortune, teaching us an important lesson. Fame and money are only temporary illusions. A man's true legacy lies not in the works he leaves behind, but in the emotional health and happiness of the children he leaves behind. And Brando's legacy, unfortunately, went down in history as murder, suicide, and unheard last words. He was the greatest actor known to the whole world, but in his own home, he was just a lost, lonely father filled with irreparable regret. In the comments, don't forget to mention what kind of father figure you think Brando was after these events. We strongly recommend that anyone struggling with such sensitive issues seek professional support. See you in the